Alright, to get started, I just want you to divide your paper up into at least 6 boxes. You can do it a different way if you want. These last two are going to be optional if you have these materials at home, salt and a crayon. So you can leave space for those if you do. If you don't, it's okay. You can just do the 6 that I have listed here. Alright, so wet on dry, wash, also is kind of known as wet on wet, wet in wet, and lift off. We're going to do that with a brush and a towel. Splatter and then fade out. Alright, so take a moment. You can pause the video to draw this in with pencil. This first one, wet on dry, just means you're going to get wet paint and put it directly on dry paper, which is right there. So just choose a color, whatever one you want, put a little bit of water from your cup into the palette, directly into that color. You can add a little bit more by just kind of dipping it in, scraping it on the side. The more water you have, the lighter the color will be. The less water you have, the darker the color will be. Okay, so I'm gonna do purple. You can just see what that looks like. All right, so it kind of gets a little rough because the paper's dry, so you can notice that difference. Just for example too, if I were to just put like a little bit of water and I do blue, I just want to compare. Still pretty light. So if you want it to be darker though, you can do multiple layers. But just here's another wet on dry. All right, the next one we're gonna do is wet on wet. So you're actually gonna wet your paper first. So make sure you rinse your brush. I always tap it on the towel before I go forward, just to minimize the drips. All right, and then wet your paper, just kind of wash it like this with the brush. And then you're going to take a color, could be any color you want. Maybe I'll try green this time. Do the same thing, just put some water in the pan, and then while the paper is still wet, you're gonna add the paint, and you can see the difference right away between when you put it on with the dry paper versus the wet paper. All right, it's a little bit easier to smooth out. You can add more. And a wash just means taking the paint and covering the entire space, kind of like nice and even. So you can add water like I just did to kind of help smooth it all out. All right, and there's your wet on wet wash. Washes are typically easier with a larger brush, so if you have other brushes at home, I recommend like a size 6 or 8 round. This is a 7, also is fine. It's a little bit easier to wash more of a space. If you have a bigger area, you can use a bigger brush if you have that at home. For wet in wet, you're going to, again, do similar what you just started with for wet on wet, the wash. Wet your paper first, and you're gonna pick 2 different colors. Start with one. I'm gonna start with yellow. Wet my brush, put it on the wet paper. And what's cool about wet in wet is you can make interesting formations like blooms and other things where the color, the other color I'm about to put in, will kind of react in a different way depending on how it wants to react. So you can kind of see it starts moving around. You can play with that. Maybe I'll put a little bit more here. So just experiment, see what happens when you put wet in wet. One thing to note too, this paper is mixed media, but it's not necessarily the best for watercolor. Other watercolor papers would help take the paint and kind of move it around a little bit more. So that's just something to think about. So play around with that wet and wet, and you can see after it dries, it's going to leave different marks. But don't rub it in too much, because then you might rip your paper, especially this type of paper. So just put a little bit on and then move on, just so you try that. Okay, the lift off. You can do this either wet on dry or wet on wet. It's up to you. I'm just going to put some paint down and start with this red. Okay, so there's two ways you can do lifting off. I like to use my brush. Usually big brushes help as well. But say you wanted to take away stuff, so just kind of tap your brush on the towel so it's just slightly damp, and then you can kind of remove the paint. I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but it does help lighten spaces if you think you went too dark. So you could rinse your brush again, tap it on the towel, and just lift off. This is a really useful technique when maybe you went a little too far on a color that you didn't want. So you can kind of see I'm taking the wet brush, wiggling it around, but the paper already is starting to crumble, so I'm going to lay off that. You can also try it with your paper towel. Sometimes that works. However, I don't think it works as well as the damp brush. I'm going to put a little bit of water on my paper towel and see what happens. Okay, so try both ways. Again, I think the brush works better. You have a little bit more control. The paper towel could work in a pinch. All right, for splatter, get your brush pretty wet. Try to put a lot of paint on it. Don't scoop the paint, but just make sure it's nice and wet and there's a lot of paint on your brush. This one you're gonna get your fingers a little dirty, but it's fun. So start by you can try this technique where if there's a lot of water on it, it'll do it on its own. You can kind of just tap it. But if you really want to try something different, put your finger on the tip and just splatter. It might not go exactly where you want it to, and that's the beauty of it. We'll see where it goes. Now it's kind of getting on all my stuff. Oh well. There's a little bit of splatter. You can add your fingerprints. Why not? Maybe start a little cluster down here and splatter. You can try to do this, just kind of hitting your brush, seeing what little shapes appear. Okay, so experiment with that one. I got it all over. So be prepared to have your splatter go all over. If you want to do that on a different paper, I'm fine with that. If you're like very particular and you don't want this stuff to get messed up. But even back to lift off, I can take it with a wet brush and sort of take off some of these things, a little bit. They're like slightly getting erased. Not really though. And then same with this, you can kind of just wet your brush if you don't want these here. We're gonna do fade out next, which is kind of what we're doing. So it's when you have something painted and then you want it to like fade out into the distance. So for example, let's say we had some sort of tree. You can make whatever you want here. Again, I just want you to practice the technique. If you look on the slides too, there's another example of how they did it. And then say I want the bottom of this to fade out more. You're just gonna go over it with a damp brush and go back and forth, wiggle it out. You can pull it down, you can push it up, you can go side to side. But as you see, it's sort of fading out and it starts creating this like nice little shadow almost. So whatever kind of thing you're trying to create, this is a really good technique for light shadows and the such. Okay, so fade out, try to fade something out like that. These last two, even if you don't have the materials, you can just watch to see what it's like. But we're gonna do salt and crayon resist. So there's lots of materials that you could use to do something similar, but if you just have a white crayon laying around or any other crayon, like a yellow one, a lighter color one, I recommend trying to use. You could draw a design first. And because it's kind of waxy, the watercolor will resist. Rubber cement works really well. You could also use like masking tape and other things like that, and then peel it off after. But I like using the crayon, so let me see if I put yellow on here. And then you can see already it's creating this effect. I'm gonna blend in some red. And this one, just kind of experiment, have some fun, see what you create. It's a good technique if you have like a drawing or painting that you want to leave some spaces white. Use the crayon resist first, like the whites of an eye, or if you're doing like an animal and you have white fur, and then you can just paint over it and not have to worry about it getting messed up. For the salt, you're going to need to, I like to do it wet on wet, especially with this paper. Let me try it with blue. So all you're gonna do is paint, like do a little wash first. You can draw a cloud, I don't know, you can do whatever you want. But while it's still wet, take your salt, and you could try different types of salt. You're just gonna sprinkle it right on there. But it has to be wet, and you experiment with different ways to do it. And then you can see it's already starting to get clustered. Once it dries, you're just gonna wipe it off, and it'll leave like a interesting effect with this like little dots and stuff. So try it out. Here, I'll bring this closer. Crayon resist and salt, the optional ones. If you have time, look at the slides for the other techniques. There's so many out there. And if you have other materials, you can experiment as well. Like rubbing alcohol is one, and I said masking tape earlier. So you can experiment a little bit more. But as long as you can do these 6 basic techniques, you are good to go.